Hello everyone, this is Bob and Threadbare, and welcome back to Threadbare Reviews. Today's request is brought to us by Joe Cool, who wants me to look at something a bit different and check out the book Magnus the Red, Master of Prospero. The book is a tie-in to the Warhammer 40k system by Games Workshop, and it's part of the Primarchs of the Horus Heresy series. More on what that means later. The book series started in 2016, and Magnus was the third novel released, and came out in 2017. About the author. Before I talk about the author, I'd like to spare a word about Warhammer 40k. Games Workshop got its start in 1975 in London, England, as a manufacturer of wooden gaming boards for public domain games like backgammon and Go. By early 1976, the company wanted to move on to newer and more interesting game formats such as video games and role-playing games. They soon managed to get the license to distribute Dungeons & Dragons in the UK on behalf of TSR, and in 1978, they opened their first retail store. In 79, they founded the Citadel Miniatures Company to create metal minis for their proprietary wargames. Their first wargame was called Reaper, and came out in 1978. The game focused on small squads and skirmishes, the sort of thing that early D&D was based around. And after 5 years and 2 editions, they decided to scale things up and create a new fantasy wargame system that they called Warhammer. The first edition created several races and factions, but it focused much more on the rules than on the setting. The second edition added more rules and created a basic setting loosely based around Earth, and the third edition made things even more elaborate and diversified the various factions. At about the same time that Warhammer's 3rd edition came out, 1987, one of Games Workshop's developers, Rick Priestley, developed a science fiction version of Warhammer, which they titled Warhammer 40,000 – Rogue Trader. Much like Reaper, Warhammer 40k started out with small-scale skirmishes and slowly built up a list of factions, units, and combat rules that were made official in later editions. Thanks to the relatively refined rules and the fact that nobody had really seen a good sci-fi fantasy wargame before, 40k would quickly eclipse regular Warhammer as the most important product Games Workshop produced. As of 2020, the game has gone through a full 9 editions and has become the most popular miniatures wargame in the world. And since Games Workshop is a very forward-thinking company, they've created a whole lot of spin-offs and other media over the decades. These include other war games, a couple dozen video games, several RPG books and board games, and a truly astounding number of licensed novels. Highlights of the novels include Caiaphas Cain, the Unlucky Commissar, Gaunt's Ghosts, the Hard-Bitten Imperial Guard Regiment, and Eisenhorn, the No-Nonsense Inquisitor. The Horus Heresy series is an extremely long set of books that stands at 56 and counting, and it focuses on the Imperium of Man back when they were at their height. Horus is a space marine primarch who betrays the Emperor of Man, his father, after being tempted by the dark gods of chaos. He severely wounds the Emperor during this betrayal and thereby starts the decline of the Empire, which is seen in the present of the 40k setting. Today's novel is not a part of the proper Horus Heresy series, but is instead part of the Primarchs of the Horus Heresy series, which focuses on various Space Marine Primarchs before the Horus Heresy kicks off. In this case, it's about Magnus the Red, Primarch of the Thousand Suns chapter, and the single strongest Psyker out of all of the Primarchs. That's where the tie-in to the theme comes in, by the way. During the Horus Heresy, Magnus uses his psychic sorcery to see Horus's betrayal coming, and then uses it again to try and warn his father, the Emperor. However, his father had told him not to practice sorcery, and so he sees Magnus as the traitor, and tells the Space Wolves Marines chapter to capture him and bring him back. But then, Horus tells the Space Wolves to massacre the Thousand Suns instead of capturing them, and in despair, Magnus teleports everyone to a planet in the depths of chaos, an act which eventually leads to him becoming a chaos demon. Anyway, the author of Magnus the Red is Graham McNeill, a Scottish writer who's worked for Games Workshop since 1999. He started out on the writing side of game development, but he also wrote a number of licensed novels, starting in 2002. He's also branched out and written lore and backstory for other games, such as a book trilogy based on the board game Arkham Horror and character backstories for League of Legends. Well, I think that's enough about the background. Let's get to the book. The review. The focus of the novel is on the planet called Morningstar, which is undergoing a massive and growing magnetic storm that will ultimately rip the planet's crust apart and render it uninhabitable. Magnus and the Thousand Suns, along with Perturabo and his Iron Warriors, respond to Morningstar's distress call, and they help its citizens evacuate. However, not everyone on the planet is willing to evacuate. Doomsday cults begin springing up, proclaiming that the only way to salvation is through death, and within a few days, they start getting violent. As the situation escalates, the planet's defense forces start massacring locals and space marines alike, and Perturabo discovers that the cause of the magnetic storm is a powerful device that's shoving two tectonic plates apart. It's impossible to hide, and therefore the corruption goes straight to the top. Meanwhile, Magnus discovers that the being behind everything is a ship called Shaitan, which has been taken over by the collective energy of every psychic who was born on Morningstar and had their psychic abilities surgically removed. The locals had a good reason for doing this, but the energy is nothing but raw psychic anger and has been brainwashing people into destroying their own planet and people. Magnus gathers the angry spirits into his psychic book, and then after he and the other Space Marines escape, they destroy the refugee fleet because there's a good chance that a lot of them are infected by the Sons of Shaitan cult. And aside from some foreshadowing to the Horus Heresy, that's the end. As far as the basic plot goes, I have no real complaints. There's a good sense of threat escalation throughout the book, and while both Magnus and Perturabo are basically living gods, they both face challenges strong enough to threaten their lives and make you wonder how they're going to pull through. The book also follows many of their Space Marine underlings, and while some of them survive, others die some pretty horrible deaths. That does bring up an issue I had with the formatting, though. I don't know how they handled the physical copy, but in the Kindle version, the only thing the book does to indicate a perspective shift is to put an extra line between the paragraphs, a line which is absent if the paragraph break happens between pages. It made things unnecessarily confusing, and I would have liked at least a little more to help make the perspective shifts clear. Another thing about the book is that you really need to know about the 40K setting and the Horus Heresy in particular if you want to understand what's going on. There's a lot of foreshadowing and references to past events that otherwise make zero sense unless you've read the main Horus Heresy series or you look up the setting history online. The latter is what I eventually did, and it made me wish I was reading about the many layers of tragedy that surrounded Magnus during and after the big betrayal. It honestly sounds like a much better plot than the one I read through, which I suppose is why they wrote it first, and this book is just a short spin-off. Still, even as a spin-off, I would have liked the novel to be more readable on its own. Adding some context wouldn't have added that much to the word count, and it would have meant getting rid of the otherwise pointless bookends that take place during the Horus Heresy and have nothing to do with the rest of the plot. As books go, Magnus the Red is entertaining enough to be worth a read, but it's not something I'd suggest you seek out. Instead, look for those highlights I mentioned earlier, or maybe read the main Horus Heresy series if this part of the setting has caught your interest. If Magnus the Red falls in your lap, go ahead and read it if you have some time, but if not, you're not missing much. The analysis. There's no major themes to this book. It mostly exists to be a quick bit of entertainment for someone who enjoys the Warhammer 40K setting and wants to experience more of it. Still, even shallow literature tends to have some sort of theme, some sort of commentary on the human condition, and Magnus the Red is no different. One of the big themes is hubris, since that's Magnus's fatal flaw, and it's the reason why he ended up falling to chaos. However, the presentation of hubris in this book is a case of telling instead of showing, since the big payoff to Magnus's hubris takes place in the main Horus Heresy novels. In this book, Magnus gets a bunch of warnings, but doesn't make any tremendously bad decisions. A more relevant theme to this book is anger is pointless and often self-destructive. Like I said earlier, the people of Morningstar had a good reason to commit atrocities against Psychers, and it was to prevent an even greater disaster that would have killed or terrorized millions of people. But the Psychic Spirit doesn't care about any of that. It wants to destroy the planet and everyone on it for something that their ancestors did. it wants revenge, even though revenge at this point is completely meaningless. And so its brainwashed disciples spread out into the world and cause death for the sake of death. They kill each other and then themselves for nothing, for the vague promise of a better life in the hereafter if they can destroy their lives here and now. A death cult, in other words. And like most death cults in real life, this one is mostly fueled by hatred and willful ignorance, by people who destroy themselves in a desperate attempt to destroy others. And that, unfortunately, is a very relevant theme these days. Thanks for joining me again for today's Threadbare review, and I hope I'll see you next time. Until then, please remember to like, share, and subscribe, and if you have a little extra money to spare, you can support me on Patreon. Link in the description.